Max Verstappen just got penalized after the race was already over. Not for a crash. Not for a fight. For crossing a line by what looks like nothing. And that tiny moment? It's part of a weekend where the FIA handed out at least 9 penalties, disqualified a Red Bull car over just 2 millimeters, and started reviewing incidents hours after the checkered flag. That's not normal. That's a warning. Because if the most dominant team in Formula 1 can get caught out by margins this small, then something much bigger is changing behind the scenes. And the real danger for Red Bull? This might only be the beginning. At first, it didn't look like a Red Bull problem. It looked like a messy weekend. Small mistakes scattered everywhere. Different drivers, different teams, nothing that clearly pointed in one direction. A lap deleted here. An investigation there. A warning that didn't seem to matter. Easy to ignore. But then the number started to grow. One decision became 2, then 3, and before anyone really noticed, the FIA had issued at least 9 separate penalties across the Miami weekend. That's when it stopped being random. Because in Formula 1, when something happens that many times in such a short space, it's not coincidence. It's a shift. Think of it like this. Imagine driving on a road you know well. Same turns, same limits, same rhythm. At first, you feel comfortable. You push a little harder each time. Then suddenly, without warning, the rules change. Speed cameras appear everywhere. Every small mistake gets flagged. Every inch matters. That's exactly what Miami became. And the drivers felt it immediately. Albon lost his time and dropped down the order after crossing track limits. Norris was investigated while fighting for pole, forced to explain himself just to keep it. Antonelli pushed too far in the sprint and lost positions because of repeated track limits. Leclerc crossed the line at the worst possible moment, and paid for it after the race was already over. Different names. Same pattern. And here's where it starts to get uncomfortable. Because while all of this was happening across the grid, Red Bull wasn't just part of the chaos. They were sitting right in the middle of the most precise, most unforgiving decisions of the entire weekend. And that's not something you can brush off. Because when the smallest margins start deciding outcomes, the team that lives closest to the limit is always the one most at risk. And Red Bull? That's exactly where they've always been. And this is where the story takes a turn, because now it's not about what drivers did on track. It's about what Red Bull brought to the track. While everyone was watching lap times and overtakes, the FIA was doing something much quieter and much more precise. They were checking the cars, measuring them. And what they found on one of the Red Bull cars changed everything. Isaac Hadjar was disqualified. Not for contact. Not for dangerous driving. For something almost invisible. The floor of his car exceeded the legal limit by just 2 millimeters. 2 millimeters. That's smaller than the edge of a coin. And yet, that tiny difference was enough to erase his entire result. No warning. No time penalty. Just disqualified. Now stop and think about what that really means. This wasn't a mistake under pressure. This wasn't something that happened in the heat of the moment. This came from design. From engineering decisions made before the car even touched the track. Which means one thing. Red Bull wasn't just pushing the limits on track. They were pushing them in the garage too. And that's where the tension starts to build. Because Formula 1 teams don't aim to stay safely inside the rules. They aim to get as close as possible without crossing the line. That's where performance is found. That extra grip. That extra speed through corners. That tiny advantage over everyone else. But here's the problem. That strategy only works when there's a margin. And in Miami, that margin disappeared. Because when the FIA starts measuring things this precisely, there's no room for interpretation. No gray area. You're either inside the rule, or you're out. And Red Bull, even if only by 2 millimeters, was out. Now connect that to what happened with Verstappen. Because this is where it gets uncomfortable. One case is technical. The other is on track. But both are decided by margins so small, they're almost invisible. And both are punished. That's not bad luck. That's a system tightening. And if that system stays this strict, then the way Red Bull has been operating for years suddenly becomes a risk. And now the pressure moves from the garage straight into the cockpit. Because once drivers realize how tight the FIA is being, everything changes. Not just how they drive, but how they think. Take Verstappen as the perfect example. You're exiting the pit lane, full focus, managing temperature, traffic, strategy, everything happening at once. And now, on top of all that, there's something else in your mind. A white line. A line you can't clearly judge from inside the car. A line that, if you touch it even slightly, might not even be called in the moment, but could be reviewed later. Hours later. That's the new reality. And this is where it becomes dangerous. Because Formula One drivers don't operate well with hesitation. Everything they do is instinct. Precision at full speed. But when you introduce doubt, even a fraction of it, performance drops. Brake a little earlier, just to be safe, you lose time. Take a slightly tighter line, you risk instability. Give yourself margin, and suddenly someone behind is faster. So now drivers are trapped in a constant calculation. Push to the limit, and risk a penalty. Or hold back, and lose performance. And neither option wins you races. That's exactly what Miami exposed. Track limits weren't just being broken because of mistakes. They were being broken because the cars are now being pushed into an even tighter operating window. Less electrical boost, more reliance on mechanical grip, forcing drivers to extract everything from the car in the corners. It's like trying to run faster on a surface that gives you less control. You're pushing harder, but the margin disappears. And when that happens, crossing the line isn't always a mistake. Sometimes, it's unavoidable. That's why Antonelli exceeded track limits multiple times and lost positions. That's why Leclerc, under pressure in the final laps, crossed that limit again and again, and got hit with a massive penalty after the race. That's why even Norris, who ended up being cleared, still had to defend himself in front of the stewards just to keep his result. Now bring that back to Red Bull. Because this is where the tension becomes real. Red Bull doesn't dominate by being cautious. They dominate by being precise, aggressive, and right on the edge. But now, that edge is no longer stable. It's unpredictable. Because even if you think you got it right, the FIA might look at it later and decide otherwise. And that uncertainty is the real problem. Because now it's not just about being the fastest on track. It's about surviving what happens after the race ends. And for a team that operates closer to the limit than anyone else, that's where the risk is highest. And this is where Miami stops being just a chaotic weekend and starts looking like a turning point. Because once you step back and connect everything, a bigger picture starts to form. This wasn't just about one penalty. Or two. It was about how the FIA chose to act. They didn't rush decisions. They didn't rely only on what happened live. They waited. They reviewed. They went back, found better angles, better data, and then made their calls. That changes the game completely. Because now, the race doesn't truly end at the checkered flag. It ends when the FIA says it ends. And that creates something Formula One teams hate more than anything. Uncertainty. Think about strategy for a second. Teams make decisions in real time. When to pit, how hard to push, where to take risks. All of that depends on one assumption, that what happens on track is final. But now, that assumption is gone. Because you might cross the line thinking everything is secure, only to lose time, positions, or even your entire result hours later. Just like Leclerc did. He finished the race, only to be hit with a massive time penalty after everything was over, dropping him down the order. That's not just a penalty. That's a delayed consequence. And delayed consequences are far more dangerous. Because you can't react to them in the moment. You can't adjust your race. You just have to wait, and hope. Now apply that to Red Bull. A team that builds its entire success on precision, timing, and pushing limits. If even a perfect race can be questioned after it ends, then how do you plan? How do you take risks? How do you know where the real limit is? That's the problem Miami exposed. Not speed. Not performance. Control. Because for the first time, Red Bull isn't just controlling races. They're being controlled by something else. A system that is becoming more detailed, more exact, and less forgiving. And when you combine that with how close they already operate to the edge, you get a dangerous combination. Because eventually, one of those post-race decisions won't be 5 seconds. It won't be small. It will hit at the worst possible moment. A fight for the win. A crucial race in the championship. A moment where there's no margin left. And when that happens, it won't feel like a surprise. It will feel like everything that started in Miami, finally catching up with them. And this is where everything finally connects, because the Verstappen penalty was never really about the penalty. It was about the message behind it. A message that became impossible to ignore once you put all the pieces together. A disqualification over 2 millimeters. A post-race penalty for crossing a white line by the smallest margin. A race filled with track limit violations, investigations, and delayed decisions. At least 9 sanctions in a single weekend. That's not random enforcement. That's the FIA drawing a new line, and making sure everyone sees it. And Red Bull, more than anyone else, is now standing right on top of that line. Because their entire advantage has always come from understanding the gray areas better than the rest. Finding performance where others stay conservative. Operating at the absolute edge of what's allowed. But now, that gray area is disappearing. And when there's no gray area, there's no buffer. No space to push without risk. No margin for those tiny calculations that used to give them an advantage. And this is why the situation feels bigger than it looks. Because nothing dramatic has happened yet. No race wins lost. No championships decided. But the conditions around Red Bull have changed. Quietly. Precisely. And maybe permanently. Because from this point forward, every race carries the same question. Not just, are we fast enough? But, are we safe enough? And that question alone changes everything. It forces hesitation. It forces compromise. It forces teams to step back from the very edge where performance lives. And for Red Bull, that's the worst place to be. Because if they step back, they lose their advantage. But if they don't, they risk being caught again. And next time, it might not be 5 seconds. It might not be invisible. It might come at the exact moment they can't afford it. A title fight. A final lap. A decision that gets reviewed after it's already too late to react. That's the real danger Miami created. Not the penalty itself, but the environment it revealed. An environment where perfection is no longer enough. Where even the smallest detail can decide everything. And where the team that lives closest to the limit is also the one most likely to cross it. So now the question isn't whether Red Bull is still the fastest team. It's whether they can survive a season where speed alone is no longer the deciding factor. Because if Miami showed anything, it's that the FIA is watching closer than ever. And this time, they're not missing anything.